This story comes from when I was around 14. The memories of what happened still haunt me, and I stay wary of the dark no matter where I go, fearing it could all happen again. One day, my father decided to bring a spiritualist into our home to try and contact some of our deceased relatives. My mother strongly opposed this idea, but at the time, I thought it was a great opportunity to find some closure regarding the loss of my loved ones. When I was about 7, I woke up suddenly one night, panicked for no clear reason. I stayed up for more than an hour, feeling an overwhelming sense of fear, though I couldn't understand why. Eventually, I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found out that my uncle had passed away in a sudden and unexpected accident. I broke down crying so hard that I nearly made myself sick. It wasn't just grief. It was the horrifying realization that somehow, deep down, I had felt something bad was coming, but I hadn't known what or to whom it would happen. Years later, I learned that the time I woke up in fear was around the exact time he had passed. That wasn't the only time I had a premonition. When I was 11, the day before Valentine's Day, my school held celebrations with candy and movies. It should have been a fun day, but I felt strangely out of place, like someone unseen was watching me. I couldn't shake the sadness that clung to me. After school, my mom picked me and my twin brother up as usual, but instead of heading home, she told us we were going to visit our grandmother. That was unusual. We normally only went on weekends. I instantly knew something was wrong. I asked my mom what had happened, but she just looked at me through the rearview mirror in silence. As we neared the house, I heard my grandfather whisper my name. At that moment, I knew. He had been battling advanced cancer that was spreading to his brain. A lump formed in my throat, but I forced myself not to cry. I wasn't entirely sure yet, and I didn't want to believe it if it wasn't true. My brother had no clue, so I kept quiet. When we arrived, my dad confirmed what I already knew. My grandfather had passed. My siblings were devastated, and I was too, but I didn't cry. I could feel that my grandfather wanted us to find peace in his passing. He had suffered long enough. My father was confused by my lack of visible grief. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him I had already known. My family looked at me in shock, except for my mother. My dad asked who had told me, and I said no one. I had simply felt it. When I explained the feelings and the voice I had heard, my father refused to believe me. He turned to my mother, assuming she had secretly told me, but when he asked my brother if he had known, he said no. That was proof my mother had told us nothing. A few months later, my grandfather visited me in a vivid dream. I believe it was his way of saying a real goodbye since I hadn't seen him for half a year before he passed. This, among other things, was why I had wanted to join the session my father arranged with the medium. I wanted closure, but my mother wouldn't allow me or my siblings inside during the session. She warned us that it wasn't safe. At the time, I had no idea how right she was. I begged for my own session, but my mother refused. Looking back, I am grateful for that. What happened afterward was disturbing enough. I can't imagine what might have happened if I had made direct contact. After the spiritualist left, everything seemed normal. But 2 weeks later, something eerie happened. The kitchen window on the second floor became covered with flies, hundreds of them, clustered together, their buzzing so loud it sounded almost like cicadas. They weren't anywhere else in the house, just that one window. By the next day, most of them were dead, and the rest had vanished. We had no idea where they had come from or why they appeared so suddenly. After that, I started noticing things I couldn't explain. It started with the tall shadow in my bedroom. It stood in the corner, just under the height of the doorframe, watching me. It only appeared when the room was dark, as though it was trying to hide, but I could still sense it. The rare times it wasn't there, I could see the glow of the kitchen light through the doorway. I knew it was angry. It hated that I could see it, but it seemed even angrier that I refused to leave. Every night I had terrifying nightmares. I could hear an enraged voice shouting at me to get out. In an attempt to protect myself, I placed a cross under my bed, hoping it would help. Instead, it made things worse. After 3 nights, the cross vanished without a trace. I tore my room apart searching for it, but it was gone. That cross had belonged to my grandfather, which made its loss even more heartbreaking. After that, the shadow began following me around the house, always lurking just in the corner of my vision. Sleep paralysis became a regular occurrence. Though I couldn't move, I never saw anything, just felt an overwhelming presence. I developed tricks to snap out of it as fast as possible. One day, while doing the dishes, I noticed a figure right behind me. It was so close, its presence sent a jolt of terror through me. Whipping around, I screamed at it, demanding to know what it wanted and begging it to leave me alone. Of course, it vanished the second I turned, but my mother rushed in, worried by my outburst. I made up an excuse, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I wish I had told her the truth. Maybe she could have helped. After that, things escalated. I began seeing what people call a mimic, a figure that copies someone's appearance or voice. It always took the form of my twin brother. The first time, I thought I saw him walking through the living room, headphones on. But when I went to talk to him, the room was empty. Called him, he wasn't even home. Another time, I had a conversation with him in my bedroom, only for him to walk into the room seconds later and repeat the exact same conversation and actions. When I told him he had just done that, he looked at me like I was crazy. The most terrifying experience happened when I was alone with our dogs. I heard heavy footsteps upstairs. Thinking there was an intruder, I grabbed a bat and called one of my dogs to my side. We searched every inch of the house. Nothing. But as I went back downstairs, a loud crash startled me. My dogs were barking wildly, forming a circle around something. In the center was a coffee cup, perfectly intact, with liquid still swirling inside. As I picked it up, the stairwell door slammed shut behind me with unnatural force. Panicked, I grabbed my dogs and bolted outside. I refused to stay in the house alone after that. We moved out 2 years later. My father and his girlfriend claimed they experienced strange things after we left, but nothing compared to what I had endured. When I finally told my dad everything, he felt guilty, admitting he never would have hired that spiritualist had he known the consequences. From what I've heard, no one has lived in that house for long. I believe whatever was open that day was never properly closed. Ever since I left, the nightmares and sleep paralysis have stopped. My advice? Never invite something unknown into your home. You have no idea what might come through. I'll start by saying I never put much stock in the supernatural or paranormal, yet the things I'm about to share have been happening to me since around 2010. My wife, who loves spooky stories, encouraged me to post this to see if anyone else has experienced something similar or can offer an explanation. I'm Daniel, and I grew up in a small town in Georgia. The first time I saw her was during my last year of high school. I call her her because I have no idea who she is. At first, she only appeared in my dreams. It was around May of 2010, and like most seniors, I was looking forward to graduation and starting a new chapter in life. My parents had split up when I was a kid, so I lived with my mom and visited my dad on weekends. My sister, who was 7 years older than me, had already moved out. That year, I moved in with my dad because he lived closer to my school and job. He had remarried, and my stepmom had 2 kids, a daughter a few years older than me and a son close to my age, born just a few weeks apart. My stepbrother and I shared a room, but he was usually out with friends or his girlfriend, so I often had the space to myself. One Friday night, he was sleeping over at a friend's house. I got home from work around 11 p.m., took a shower, and collapsed into bed. I distinctly remember leaving the light on when I dozed off. Then I started to dream, but it didn't feel like a regular dream. It was more intense, more real. In the dream, I was walking through my high school gym toward the locker room when I heard crying. I followed the sound into the shower area, where all the showers were running. In the middle stood a girl with long, dark hair covering her face, sobbing. My first thought was, why is there a girl in the boys' locker room? But I kept moving toward her. I reached out and gently touched her shoulder. The second I made contact, she snapped upright. Her face had no eyes, just hollow, empty sockets. I staggered backward in shock, and in that instant, I woke up. I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My heart pounded as I tried to catch my breath. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The room was completely dark. I was absolutely certain I had left the light on when I fell asleep. Panic set in as I stood up, and that's when I saw it. Across the room, a shadowy figure stood completely still. I couldn't make out any details except for its long hair. My instinct was to turn on the light, but when I flipped the switch, nothing happened. I even pinched myself to make sure I wasn't still dreaming. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I was too terrified to close my eyes again and stayed awake until morning. Years later, I had my own apartment and was living with my wife. We shared a large bed with our 2 dogs, which meant I usually ended up sleeping on the very edge of the mattress. One night, around 3 a.m., I got up to use the bathroom. When I returned, I crawled back into bed, rolled onto my side, and faced the wall, which was also in the direction of the slightly open bedroom door. We always left it cracked for the dogs. The room was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw her. She was standing right next to my bed, her long hair hanging down, obscuring her face. She was hovering over me. Pure terror shot through me, and I jerked up so fast that I accidentally knocked our tiny Yorkie off the bed. I felt awful about it later, but in that moment, all I could think about was turning on the light. As soon as I did, she was gone. My wife, startled awake, saw my face and immediately asked what was wrong. I told her everything, and neither of us slept for the rest of the night. But the worst experience happened in December of 2023. I work about 30 minutes from home on the night shift. My wife also works nights, but in a different section of the factory. Normally, we drive home together, but that night, she was sick and had to stay home, so I was alone. The route to work involves a long back road, and about halfway there, I have to cross what we call the twin bridges, 2 short bridges over a deep river. My wife hates that stretch and always shuts her eyes when we drive over it, but I never minded it. That night, something felt off. I assumed it was just because my routine was different. I crossed the first bridge without issue, but as I neared the second, I spotted something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone's car had broken down, but there was no vehicle anywhere. As I got closer, I saw her. This time, her face was visible. Her mouth was wide open, but no sound came out, just a silent scream. Cold fear gripped me. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. As I raced past, a horrific, unnatural scream rang out, something between a banshee's wail and an animal's roar. I've never heard anything like it before or since. I didn't stop driving until I reached work, where I immediately called my wife. That entire night, I jumped at every little sound, dreading the drive back home. At least by morning, it was daylight. I haven't seen her since, but I feel like I'm just waiting for the next time. There's no pattern to when she appears. First, it was just a dream. Then she was in my room. And then that awful night on the bridge. Who is she? What does she want? Has anyone else experienced anything like this? I just want her to leave me alone. This story takes place around 6 or 7 years ago. At the time, I was about 14 or 15. I live in central Michigan, not as densely wooded as the northern part of the state, but also not as developed as the southern areas. It's a mix of scattered towns, patches of forest, farmland, and small communities. For context, I live in a mobile home park off a road about 2 miles from the nearest town, so it's somewhat isolated. Alongside the road next to the park are 2 ditches. One of them runs for about 50 yards before stopping at one entrance. Then another entrance begins where a larger ditch starts. This bigger ditch is narrow at first but widens into a decent-sized pond near the back of the park. Close to this ditch, there's a thin strip of forest, really just a 200-yard trail lined with trees on both sides, connecting the edge of the park to the road. My older brother used to live with our grandmother in this park when he was younger. He told me eerie stories about that wooded trail, strange sounds, odd things found in the dirt. He even once claimed he dug up a human skull, though I always suspected he was just trying to scare me. He also talked about a shadowy figure that supposedly roamed the area, saying the land was once native territory and might be cursed. Now that you know the setting, here's what happened. It was a warm, overcast, and windy autumn afternoon. My friend Jake and I used to spend a lot of time outdoors, playing army games with sticks as makeshift rifles. We never had toy guns, so we used whatever we could find and let our imaginations do the rest. The trailer park had several abandoned, run-down mobile homes that hadn't been removed yet, which made for an interesting setting to play in. Anyone who's played with stick guns knows how valuable a good stick can be. That day, I found one that was just right for a rifle. Jake, on the other hand, was struggling to find one big enough to be his machine gun. After searching the park with no luck, he suggested we check the woods. Normally, we avoided that area. It was unsettling, and the sticks there were usually too twisted or fragile. But that day, we decided to give it a shot. As we walked up the trail, I felt an odd weight in the air, like we were intruding. The wind picked up, and since most of the leaves had already fallen, the tall cottonwoods whistled in an eerie way. We made it about halfway down the trail, scanning the ground for sticks. I wasn't very focused on the search. I was more concerned about insects and just wanted to get out of there. But Jake was determined, digging through piles of fallen branches, looking for the perfect one. There's one detail I should mention. About halfway along the trail to the right, there's a small, secluded area we called the island. It's cut off from the main path by thick shrubs with thorny branches. As Jake rummaged through the debris near this area, we both noticed something. Complete silence. The usual background noises of birds and insects had vanished. Then we saw it. Ahead of us, low-hanging branches were swaying, except there was no wind strong enough to move them like that. It was as if someone or something was shaking them on purpose. Then we heard it. The crunch of dry leaves about 20 feet to my right. I turned my head and saw it clearly. A hunched-over shadow-like figure. It wasn't translucent. It was solid black, its back unnaturally curved, its arms stretched forward, and at the wrists, its hands bent down like an animal's front paws. It moved in a bizarre tiptoe-like motion, darting through the trees and bushes as if they weren't even there. It was coming toward us. It felt like it had one purpose, to chase us away. The moment I saw it moving in our direction, I smacked Jake on the shoulder and took off, yelling, "Run!" Jake shouted something behind me, but I wasn't listening. My instincts had taken over. We sprinted through the underbrush, tripping over roots and dodging branches until we finally burst out of the woods. I collapsed against a large tree, gasping for air. About half a minute later, Jake came crashing out of the trees, just as breathless and completely confused about why I had bolted so suddenly. I explained what I had seen. His face turned serious. He admitted that he had paused to catch his breath halfway out, and in that moment, he heard something moving, something fast, but also strangely slow, as if it existed in multiple moments at once. He caught a glimpse of a dark shape, but he couldn't describe it clearly. To this day, neither of us knows exactly what we encountered, but we both believe that piece of land, at least that particular stretch of woods, is cursed or maybe home to something that doesn't want visitors. And whatever it was, it made sure we understood that we weren't welcome. When I was much younger, I had a close friend I spent countless hours with. He lived in one of the older houses in our town, one with dark, detailed woodwork, stone walls in the basement, and a silence that always felt just a little too deep. There was something about the place that never sat right with me, though as a child, I couldn't quite put into words what unsettled me. Two experiences in that house remain vivid in my mind, leaving behind an unease I still can't shake. The first occurred while I was playing with my friend in the living room. Near the front door hung an old painting I had walked past plenty of times before, but that day, I found myself staring at it, drawn in for reasons I couldn't explain. It showed a young boy sitting atop a wooden rocking horse, smiling. One arm rested on the horse, while the other was raised near his head. But something about it seemed wrong. That's when I noticed a strange air bubble in the paint, right where the boy's hand was. The shape resembled a blade. It wasn't part of the original artwork. It was clearly a raised bubble, like something had forced its way beneath the paint. I pointed it out to my friend, and we both studied it for a while. I figured it was just some odd imperfection, maybe caused by age, but it was far too precise in its shape and placement. My friend only shrugged and said, "Weird things like that happen here all the time, but I'm used to it." That comment unsettled me, but I tried to push it out of my mind. When my mom picked me up later, I left, planning to forget all about the painting. But when I returned the next day, the knife shape was gone, like it had never existed. Even stranger, the boy in the painting was no longer grinning. His face had gone blank, as if he were posing for a serious portrait. I still have no explanation for what happened, but I'll never forget the cold feeling that settled in my chest. Years later, I found myself babysitting in that same house. Late at night, I sat in the living room watching a movie with the younger child I was looking after when I heard doors upstairs slamming shut, one after another. Asterisk bang, bang, bang. Asterisk the sound was forceful, not like a gust of wind or a random draft. It was deliberate. Normally, I would have bolted out of there. I'm not exactly the bravest person, but I couldn't leave the child alone. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept upstairs, switching on every light as I went. When I reached the top, every single door stood wide open. I exhaled in shaky relief until I noticed the family dog by the front door. The dog stood stiff, completely still, staring at something outside. Its ears were pinned back, and a low, fearful growl rumbled from its throat. It wasn't an aggressive sound. It was pure fear. Then I spotted the basement door. It had a small window which lined up with another window outside. For some reason, I turned to look, and that's when I saw him. A boy's face appeared outside for just a split second, but it wasn't someone crouching and peering in. No, it was a severed head, eyes turned upward, as though the rest of the body was buried beneath the ground. Then, in an instant, it was gone. It didn't retreat or move away. It simply ceased to exist. A wave of ice spread through my body. Every hair on my arms stood on end. Had I imagined it? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the boy from the painting had returned to play. After that, I avoided spending time in that house. That sense of being watched never left me. There was something in that home beyond my friend and his family. Something unseen but very, very real. To this day, I still wonder what or who truly lived inside those walls. Growing up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I was always warned about the old trails. Some were well-worn routes leading to breathtaking views, but others, my grandfather would say, were left alone for a reason. When I was 17, my friends and I decided to take a shortcut through one of those neglected paths to reach our campsite before nightfall. It was overgrown, barely a trail at all, but we pushed forward, laughing off my grandfather's warnings. As we moved deeper into the woods, an eerie silence took over. The birds stopped singing, the wind seemed to die down, and even the leaves barely rustled. Then we started seeing the carvings. Symbols cut deep into tree trunks, some fresh, others old and weathered. They were spirals, circles, and figures with impossibly long limbs. None of us knew what they meant, but every single one pointed in the same direction, forward. By the time we realized we were lost, the sun had already slipped behind the mountains. That's when the whispering started. At first, it was barely noticeable, like the breeze shifting through the branches. Then it became clearer, murmuring voices just outside the reach of our flashlights. We called out, half expecting someone to answer, but no one did. The whispers only grew, surrounding us. Panic set in. We turned back the way we had come, but the path was different, narrower, darker. The symbols had changed too. No longer abstract shapes, but distorted human figures with empty, hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Then we saw them. Shadowy, impossibly tall figures stood among the trees, just at the edge of our sight. They moved when we weren't looking, shifting closer each time we blinked. One of them took a step forward. My friend let out a scream and bolted. The rest of us followed, crashing through the underbrush, running blindly. The whispers twisted into laughter, mocking, unnatural. Somehow, we stumbled out onto an old dirt road. When we turned back, the entrance to the trail was gone. No break in the trees. No sign we had ever been there. My friend was never the same after that night. He stopped talking to us, and a year later, he moved away. I tried to put it out of my mind. But just last week, while hiking near our cabin with my girlfriend, I noticed something carved into a tree. One of those same symbols, freshly cut. And beneath it, in deep, jagged letters, was my name. I don't think we were supposed to escape that night, and I don't think they ever stopped watching. A few nights later, I heard something outside our cabin. At first, I told myself it was just the usual sounds. The wind, branches shifting, the house settling. But then I heard it again. The whispering. It was right outside the window. I lay frozen, barely breathing. My girlfriend, Emily, slept soundly beside me, unaware. Slowly, I turned my head, heart hammering in my chest. Through the thin curtain, I saw it. A tall silhouette standing at the tree line, watching. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They weren't normal, too long, too twisted, as if whatever had been out there was only pretending to be human. The dirt beneath a nearby tree had been disturbed, and carved into its bark was a new message. You left. We remember. I didn't tell Emily. I didn't want to scare her. I didn't know what they wanted. We left that night, and I pray I never hear them again.